So hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm Jonathan Way. So I'm going to be giving a talk for this session. So my title is in two parts. So why be moral? The rational significance of the distinction between self and others. And I'll explain how these things are connected in a moment. Okay, so the question of why be moral is one of the kind of great classic philosophical questions. This has been discussed by philosophers since the start of philosophy. So here's a story from Plato's Republic, which vividly illustrates this story, this question. So this is the story of the ring of Gyges. So Plato describes, so it says, a shepherd, Gyges, is watching over his flock when a storm breaks and the earthquake opens the ground next to him. Looking around, he finds a giant corpse wearing a gold ring, which he removes. Twisting the ring this way and that, Gyges finds that he can make himself invisible and appear again. He immediately works out how to use this to his advantage. He seeks out the king's wife and seduces her. With her help, he murders her husband, Canduales, and takes the crown for himself. Okay, so Gyges finds this ring, which allows him to become invisible, and he uses this to his advantage in various ways. So, commenting on this story, a character in Plato's dialogue, Gracon, says the following. So Gracon says, "No one, it seems, would be so incorruptible that he would stay on the path of justice or stay away from other people's property when he could take whatever he wanted from the marketplace with impunity. He could go into people's houses and have sex with anyone he wished, kill or release anyone from prison, anyone he wished, and do all of the other things that would make him like a god among humans. Someone who didn't want to do injustice, given this sort of opportunity, and who didn't touch other people's property would be thought wretched and stupid by everyone aware of the situation." So Gracon's claim here is that if you had something like the ring of Gyges, which allowed you to do injustice, to treat people badly, treat people unfairly, and you had the power to do all of that with impunity, so it wouldn't, so you could get away with this, then he thinks, firstly, people would do that. If you could get away with injustice, then you would do. And secondly, that you'd be stupid not to. If you didn't do that, then you would be you'd be thought wretched and stupid. So Gracon's claiming here, in effect, that the only reason we ought to be moral, the only reason we ought to care about others, take other people's interests into account, is because normally or often there's a risk of that being moral is what's good for us. So if we don't do the right thing, then that'll be bad for us. But if that's not the case, then we'd have perfectly good reasons to act badly. Okay, so this is a kind of very dramatic and fantastical story. But the question that's raised by it, the question of why be moral, question of why be just, why treat people fairly, why respect people's rights, why more generally just take other people's interests into account, and in particular, why do those things when you could get away with not doing them? That question can also be illustrated with reference to much more mundane examples, or perhaps familiar examples. So we can think about, why should the gangster who can get away with having a witness killed not do so? If it's going to be in the gangster's interest to have the witness disposed of, isn't that what it makes most sense for them to do? We can think of like why be faithful to your partner if you could get away with it. If you could cheat on your partner and enjoy that, and there'd be no bad consequences, why not do so? Or perhaps more mundanely still, if you find a lost wallet and you could get away with keeping the money inside it, why not keep it for yourself? So these are all just illustrations of this general question of why be moral, and in particular, why be moral if being moral won't be in your interest. And so this is, as I say, one of the kind of classic questions of philosophy. It's a question that philosophers spent a lot of time trying to figure out. So I want to say a little bit about how I understand this challenge, this question, and how we can approach it. So far we've just put things in terms of why be moral. It can often, I think, be helpful, or can be helpful to put things in terms of whether we have good reasons to be moral. We can also think here about the term moral. So I think the term moral here is not really doing all that much work. I mean, the question here really is, well, do we have good reasons to take other people's interests into account? We can just formulate this challenge just by thinking about the particular types of examples I'm describing. So insofar as our actions will affect other people, do we have good reason? Should we care about other people's interests, or should we only care about other people's interests insofar as they impinge on our own interests? So I think putting it that way brings out how this is a question about self and others. The question is, in effect, is it only our own interests that matter for what's rational to do, or do other people's interests matter? Do we, when we're deciding what to do, is it rational to take other people's interests into account directly? So that's the challenge. That's the question. I think we should think of this as a skeptical challenge. So I think that we ordinarily do, most of us, assume that we do have good reasons to be moral. We do have good reasons to take other people's interests into account. And what's more, we have some sense of kind of what those reasons are. I think we ordinarily think that the fact that something will harm someone else, that just does count against doing it. The fact that something would treat someone unfairly just does count against doing it. So I think that this should be thought of as a challenge to our ordinary way of thinking about this. And insofar as that's right, that means there's two kind of strategies that we might make use of to appeal to it, to answer it. Sorry. So one is a kind of ambitious approach. So the ambitious response to skepticism is to try and show that it's rational to be moral on terms which the skeptic themselves would accept. So the skeptic here is the person who doubts that it makes sense to be moral. The skeptic here is Gracon in the example from the Republic. The skeptic is the person saying, we only have reason to care about others insofar as that will benefit us. If what's in our interest is to ride roughshod over other people's interests, then that's the thing to do. So the ambitious response to skepticism tries to take on the skeptic on their own terms, tries to show from premises, from claims that the skeptic will accept, that the skeptic is mistaken and that we should care about other people. A second approach is more modest. So the more modest approach doesn't aim to show the skeptic that they're wrong not to care about others. It doesn't aim to convince the skeptic themselves to take other people's interests into account. It rather aims only to show that the skeptic hasn't done enough to convince us. The skeptic hasn't done enough to change our minds insofar as we came into this thinking that other people's interests do matter. The skeptic hasn't done enough to show that we're wrong to think that. So those are sort of two broad families of approach. I'm going to talk about one version of each approach. Okay, so I'll start with a version of an ambitious approach, and the version that I'll be interested in is can be traced, has its roots in was very influentially and importantly defended by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. So the basic idea for Hobbes was to defend morality in terms of self-interest. So Hobbes says that the rules of morality are those that would be adopted by the far-sighted, prudent man concerned with his own survival, security, and well-being. So the idea is that even if we're only ultimately concerned with our own survival, security, and well-being, nonetheless, it would be prudent to adopt the rules of morality, to adopt rules which take other people's interests into account. So I think there are several reasons that we might think that this is true. So we typically do depend on the cooperation of others. We can't get very far in life without cooperating with others. And cooperating with others requires us to trust others. It requires us to not just screw people over whenever we have the opportunity. What's more, we're typically unable to conceal violations of moral rules in the long term. It's like, in the ordinary case, it's just very difficult to get away with treating badly all the time. Furthermore, most of us do have a sense of sympathy. So most of us are pained by hurting others. Most of us can take some pleasure from helping others. So insofar as we take pleasure from helping others and are pained by hurting them, that gives us kinds of reasons of self-interest, of our own well-being, to treat people morally. Finally, it does seem plausible that we would all do better in the long run if we all accept and act on moral rules than if we flout them. So societies in which people generally respect each other, help each other when they're in need, can be relied on to keep their promises, are truthful with each other, those societies are going to be nicer, more productive places to live. You'd much rather live in a society where you can kind of go freely about your business without worrying about being attacked every time you walk out into the streets, or constantly worrying about having your property taken from you. So I think all of those points are important. I think they're all kind of worth emphasizing. So it does seem true that very often there are self-interested reasons to be moral. Very often, being moral does pay. Nonetheless, we might find that as a response to this problem, we might find it ultimately unsatisfying. And that's for two reasons. So one is that it seems that this strategy is going to be somewhat limited. So it seems that really the most that it could show is that for most of us, most of the time, it's in our interest to be moral. So most of us don't have the ring of Gyges. Most of us can't get away with acting badly, and so for most of us, most of the time, it makes sense to be moral. But the worry about the rationality of the morality, the worry about the question of why we should be moral, seems most pressing in cases in which it's not in our interest to be moral. It seems most pressing in these cases where it seems that someone can get away with doing wrong. And this kind of Hobbesian approach doesn't seem like it can answer those cases. It seems that at most what it might say is those cases are less numerous than perhaps we might have thought. But that's just kind of, maybe that's reducing the problem, but it doesn't seem like it's getting rid of the problem. There's also a second worry, which is that this approach seems to give the wrong kind of reason to be moral. So we don't think of the person who is honest and respectful of other people's property, but only does that out of self-interest as a moral person. If you treat people well only insofar as you take that to be beneficial to you, it doesn't seem that you thereby count as a morally admirable person. So if what we wanted was a vindication of what we would ordinarily think of as moral reasons, so at the start I said that I think we do have a sense that sense of what the reasons to be moral are, and they're other people's interests. So the reason that we should keep promises is because we made those promises. The reason we should respect other people's property is because it's that's their property. The reason we should be concerned with other people's suffering is because they're suffering. So insofar as we want a vindication of those things as reasons, then it's not clear that Hobbes's approach can give us that. It seems that Hobbes's approach is always going to say the ultimate reason is that it's good for you. Okay, so I think there's reason to be doubtful that Hobbes's approach can succeed, at least in kind of as a full answer to the question. Moreover, perhaps that's indicative that the ambitious strategy more generally can't succeed. So the ambitious strategy was trying to show on terms that the skeptic could accept that we have reasons to be moral. And perhaps that's just not possible. Should we therefore conclude that the moral skeptic is right and that we don't always have reasons to be moral? Well, I don't think we do, because as I said, there's also the more modest approach. So the modest approach says it's for the skeptic to convince us that that the skeptic is right and that we're wrong to think that there are good reasons to be moral. How do we do that? Well, how do we take this approach? Well, the idea would be to say, well, look, it's for the skeptic to show that we're wrong, and so what we have to do is examine the skeptic's arguments and see if they succeed. So we're not trying to bring the skeptic around to morality. We just need to be content with our case for morality. We need to be content that the skeptic hasn't undermined what we would ordinarily think of as good reasons to be moral. Okay, so I want to sketch in a bit more detail how this kind of approach might go, and I want to take some inspiration from Kant. Oh, I don't have Kant on the picture. Okay, I think Kant's on the next slide. Okay, so yeah, on the modest approach, our task is to rebut the skeptic's argument. So the skeptic says, you don't have good reason to take other people's interests into account. We say, why is that the case? And then the skeptic has to tell us. How might the skeptic argue here? Well, one thing they might do is appeal to what we might call the self-interest theory of reasons. So the self-interest theory of reasons is a theory about what we have good reason to do, and it just says, well, we only have reason to do what's in our interest. So when we're deciding what to do, the only things that it makes sense to take into account are our own interests, at least ultimately. This idea, as we saw, perhaps that's implicit in Gracon's comments on the ring of Gyges case. And it certainly seems right that if we start with this assumption, it is going to be hard to show that we all have good reasons to be moral. And it seems like that might be what we've learned from reflecting on Hobbes, that self-interested reasons to be moral only go so far. But then the question we should ask is, well, why should we start from this assumption? Why is this the default theory of reasons? What's to be said for this theory of reasons as opposed to other theories, other accounts on which other people's interests might give us reasons as well? Okay, so to develop this point further, I'd like to appeal a little bit to Immanuel Kant. So I think a way we can go here is to back up a little bit and think about why our own interests give us reasons. So why, for instance, do I have reasons to eat healthily and exercise and improve my education and cultivate friendships and set myself goals and aspirations? Why do I have reasons to do those things? Now that's such a kind of that might seem just such a sort of foundational question that it might be hard to see how to go about answering it. But I think that one thing we might say here, and this is sort of where we're to some extent drawing on inspiration from Kant, is so, well, insofar as we take those things to give us reasons, we're taking it that we are valuable in a certain way. In looking after my health, in exercising, in trying to improve my education, in seeking out new aspirations and projects, I'm treating myself as if I matter. Perhaps more fully, I'm treating some of my characteristic human capacities, my capacity for happiness, my capacity for achievement, autonomy, understanding. I'm treating those things as if they matter. I'm treating them as valuable. Insofar as I'm trying to look after those things and develop them, I'm treating them as things which are worth looking after and worth developing. What's more, I treat these things as worth pursuing and developing in and of themselves. That's the difference between the way I treat myself and the way I treat an artifact like a car or a kettle or a DVD player. I might treat those things as valuable for certain purposes. I might look to keep them healthy and functioning insofar as I want to maintain those purposes. But I don't treat them as valuable in and of themselves. So that's why I'm happy to get rid of my DVD player when I stop watching DVDs. So the idea here is that in taking our own interest to give us reasons, we are treating ourselves as valuable, and in particular, we're treating certain capacities that we have as valuable, our capacities for happiness and achievement and autonomy and understanding. Those kinds of centrally human capacities are being treated as valuable. Of course, though, there's nothing special about me. So I treat myself as valuable in looking after my health and seeking achievements and so on. But there's nothing. There's nothing distinctive there about me. It's not just me who has the capacity for happiness and for achievement and understanding. It's other people too. So the natural thought at this point is then, well, look, if I'm valuable, if I matter in virtue of being a creature who's capable of happiness and autonomy and achievement and understanding, then insofar as you're capable of those things, then you matter too. So if my interests give me reasons, if I should take account of my own interests in deciding how to act, why don't yours too? Why shouldn't I also take your interests as mattering? Now, some philosophers, perhaps Kant, have tried to kind of wield those thoughts on behalf of an ambitious response to the skeptic. So they've tried to show that the skeptic is being somehow inconsistent or irrational in saying that we only have reason to care about ourselves. I think, though, that we don't need to make such a strong claim in order to defend a modest response to the skeptic. So I think it's enough to point out that what the skeptic is doing here is placing just huge weight on the difference between self and others. They're saying there's this massive difference in the rational significance of my interests and the rational significance of your interests. But if we think about it in this kind of broadly Kantian way, so if we think about it in terms of treating ourselves as valuable, and we think about what we take to be worth pursuing, what we take to have reason to do as reflecting what we take to be valuable, then it looks arbitrary to say I'm valuable but you're not. And so the skeptic has to give some other story about why our interests give us reasons, or perhaps try and somehow defend the idea that each of us has a special kind of value to themselves, which doesn't apply to other people. And so that then just looks like, I think, a difficult challenge. I should note, by the way, that we don't have to deny that the distinction between self and others has some rational significance. So I think it is indeed plausible that we have extra reasons to be concerned with ourselves and to give priority to ourselves. But that's a long way from saying that we have no reason to be concerned with other people. So looked at in this way, it looks like it's not that Gracon is kind of raising this kind of sort of common sense idea that we all secretly think that it's only ourselves that matter. It's rather that Gracon, or the moral skeptic, is putting this huge weight on this distinction between our own interests, an individual's interests, and everyone else's. And it's not clear that that can bear that weight when if we think that we have reasons to care about ourselves, and that's because we're ourselves valuable. Okay, so again, none of this is meant to sort of demonstrate that we ought to care about others. So if someone doubts that they should be moral, it's not what I've said is not intended to convince them that they should. The point is rather to kind of throw the challenge back to the skeptic, to try and point out that the idea that we only have reason to do what will benefit us, so the idea that self-interest is the only thing that gives us reasons to act, that claim requires defence, and it's not clear how that claim could be defended, given some natural thoughts, I think, about the relationship between what we have reason to do and what we take to be valuable. So yeah, the skeptical response, the skeptical idea seems to arbitrarily place this huge weight on the difference between self and others. Okay, so let me just sum up. So I've introduced this question of why be moral, the question of what reason do we have to take other people's interests into account. I've tried to present this as a kind of skeptical challenge, as a challenge to what we ordinarily take for granted. And so there are therefore two kinds of approach that we can take. We can try and refute the skeptic on their own terms, try and show that even from the skeptic's starting points, we should take account of the interests of others. And so we looked at Hobbes's approach as an illustration of that, and raised some doubts about whether that could succeed. And then we tried to sketch a more modest approach on which what we try to do is just undermine the skeptic's challenge. So we try and show that the skeptic's challenge is not itself well-grounded. And the way I've suggested we do this is by arguing that insofar as we take ourselves to have reasons to care about ourselves, that involves taking ourselves to be valuable, but it's not clear what could make a difference between the value of ourselves and the value of others, so that to support the conclusion that it's only our interests that give us reasons. So from that perspective, the skeptical position looks somewhat arbitrary. Okay, so that concludes my talk.